Well, the advertised title for today's lecture is China's Future, Panda, Tiger, or Something Else. Eric A. Hyer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Brigham Young University and Asian Studies Coordinator here at the Kennedy Center, has traveled extensively within China, Tibet, and twice traversed the Karakoram Highway between Western China and Pakistan. That's a story and a lecture in and of itself. Hyer's research focuses on Chinese foreign relations, especially relations with its neighbors. His field research has taken him to Russia, Vietnam, and Mongolia, and along China's border with Central Asia. He is the author of articles about China's arms sales, territorial disputes, and nationality issues, and is in the process of completing a book on China's boundary disputes and settlements. Professor Hyer was a visiting scholar at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing in 1995. He received a PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1990. And I might mention he's also been involved with numerous projects in his role as the director for BYU's portion of the Asian Consortium, which is a Title VI National Resource Center. He's very actively involved not only in the Asian Studies academic program that he coordinates, but in K-12 outreach to business, media, and the community, as well as endeavors here at BYU that focus on Asian studies. BYU is one of only two Pan-Asian centers that received the grant. BYU and the University of Utah is one, and Georgetown University is the other. And that's largely due to our faculty efforts that Professor Hyer has helped to coordinate. So today, alternative perspectives on U.S.-China relations. What is China's future? Please welcome Professor Eric Hyer.
Thanks. Before I get started, one programming note for students who are in my Chinese politics class. There's a box over on the table there that says Political Science 353 papers. You can put your paper that's due today in that box. The lecture that I want to give today, and actually probably have to hurry through, is based upon some research I was doing over the last year and has been recently published in a chapter in a book, which celebrates, I guess I put that in quotes, celebrates the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, which was celebrated last year. And I was given the task of looking at U.S.-China relations. Now, so the question, and this comes up all the time, people ask, so what's the future of U.S.-China relations? Is China rising? Is it this big dragon? Or is it this panda bear? And I kind of have this shtick that I talk about with people, like, you know, they're in the United States, there are panda huggers, people who think that China is exotic and wonderful, and there are dragon slayers, people who think that China's rising and menacing. To launch off, then, I look at there's a book by James Mann. He's a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. He wrote a book called China Fantasy, in which he set out three scenarios, basically the soothing scenarios, what he called it, where there are liberals in the United States, and by liberal I mean, you know, traditional Jeffersonian liberals, not the left-wing liberals, who believe that as China develops economically and becomes integrated more and more into the world, naturally China will also become a democratic nation and and peace will prevail. An alternative scenario is the upheaval scenario, one entertained by realists who believe that a single party dictatorship in China, you know, will eventually collapse, and China will reassemble itself as a democracy or something. But along the way, China could be very threatening to the United States before this happens. Yet a third scenario is an argument that I put forward that the single party dictatorship in China continues. China continues its strong economic growth and takes its place as a leader of the world, as it's doing very rapidly, and nothing much changes politically. So you're faced with a China that is both economically powerful, militarily powerful, and still committed as a communist nation, and has power to pursue its influence in the United States, around the world. And so I asked the question, what are the implications of these scenarios? And to get at this, I'm going to lead you down a theoretical path and talk about this theoretically, because each one of these scenarios, whether you see China as becoming eventually democratic, or whether you see China as a growing menace to the United States, or some third scenario that you might have in mind, these are all rooted in rather basic theoretical perspectives that we have, sometimes unconsciously, but hopefully more consciously. These are the more menacing view is based in a neorealist structural realist perspective that sees inevitable conflict between great powers. The neoliberal idea, liberal institutionalism, means as China becomes more and more integrated into the international system, World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, that it will become a much more stakeholder in the system and therefore will not be menacing, but will in fact cooperate, in fact adapt Western values of democracy and free trade and things. And then there's a third theoretical perspective, and that's domestic politics. We need to look at domestic politics about it. The argument basically is that a state's foreign policies are driven largely by its domestic politics. And so I want to look at that a little bit. And I have some interesting public opinion polling that we can look at. So to start out with let's start out with if we can get it to move. Somebody? It's a new thing. There we go. Let's start out with the rather menacing neo-realist perspective. Neo-realism assumes that the world's an anarchic system. That doesn't mean it's chaotic. It just means that there's no world government. And states, of course, naturally seek their own interests. They seek to enhance their military power and economic power to defend themselves because in the real world there is no 911. You can't call and say, please save me, I'm being attacked. You have to save yourself, which we call the security dilemma. That as others increase their power, and it decreases your power relatively. So all states are risk averse, and they seek to enhance their power in order to defend themselves against in a rather hostile environment in the international system. Evidence. What evidence is there that this is actually the way the world is? In China's 1996, tested missiles across the straits from Taiwan. It was during an election period of time, and the U.S. responded by sending 2 aircraft carrier task force there, and we went eyeball to eyeball with the Chinese in this militarized international dispute. It didn't lead to shooting, but nevertheless, we had to stare them down there. Later on in 2001, actually April 1st of 2001, no joke, a U.S. EP-3 spy plane was shot down as it cruised along the coast of China, spying on the Chinas, doing electronic intercept, and we had to engage in negotiations to get the crew and the plane back eventually. And over the past years, the South China Sea has become increasingly kind of hot, and there's been several, 6 that I counted to date, naval incidents where we and the Chinese have confronted each other on the high seas in the Yellow Sea or the South China Sea. A Chinese government official, actually a naval official, said, quote, "We will not tolerate American dominance indefinitely in an area it views as its strategic sphere of influence." Basically telling the Americans that the South China Sea and the East China Sea are America's sphere of influence, and just like in the years past through the Monroe Doctrine, you claim the Caribbean and other places as off-limits to Europeans, we're going to claim these areas as off-limits to the United States, and so that's normal behavior for a great power. The conclusion then is that the world we're experiencing this period of transition. China is going through a dramatic growth period. The United States is relatively in decline. Doesn't mean we're becoming weaker, but relative to China, we are becoming weaker. And these kind of hard and soft changes are taking place in the world, and eventually there could be conflict between the United States and China, but what we call a structural conflict. One of the most strongest proponents of this is a guy by the name of John Mersheimer, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and he says in a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he says, when China becomes an economic powerhouse, it will almost certainly translate its economic might into military might and make a run at dominating Northeast Asia. Therefore, China and the United States are destined to be adversaries as China's power grows. It's quite an ominous prediction. Another realist, not a neo-realist, but rather a neocon, famous for getting us into the Iraq War, Paul Wolfowitz, he made this interesting historical observation where he says he sees China as a Germany. As we all know, the history of Germany with provoking 2 world wars, Germany felt, especially under the Nazis, felt like a wounded nation. It felt like it had been denied its status in the world, and therefore pursued military capabilities to lash out and try to adjust the world system into a place where it took its rightful place. It sounds a lot like China's sense of wounded nationalism and things like this. And he points out that Bismarck was okay, but after Bismarck, then things went badly because of a string of incompetent leaders, and he sees the same thing as a problem in China. China is going through a leadership transition. This year, we will see new untested leadership come to power. These are people with little or no experience in international relations. And so their competence in foreign policy is questioned by Wolfowitz and others, and they see that this kind of, as China grows more powerful and inexperienced leadership comes to the presidency, and we'll go through our own elections this year too and have untested and probably presidents with little foreign policy experience, unless Obama is reelected, an untested leadership also. So Wolfowitz sees that this creates a problem in international relations. But let me give you some counter-arguments. Think of the United States. The United States rose as a great power, becoming a superpower, and did not provoke world war. World War I and World War II, we participated in those wars, but we did not provoke those wars. We did have our adventures in Korea and Vietnam and proxy wars, but no system-wide or world war was provoked by the rise of the United States as a superpower. European nations tended to accept it. The Soviet Union didn't like it, but we had a confrontation with them, but we didn't go to war with the Soviet Union. So the question is, why can't China rise much like the United States rose? It will have a very different ideological system, possibly. It will have different interests, but why does that inevitably mean we will go to war? Just because a new power rises to superpower status does not necessarily mean we should have a world war. Robert Kaplan, who is also a realist, takes this view and says today China's ambitions are as aggressive as those of the United States in a century ago, but completely different reasons. China does not take a missionary approach to the world affairs, seeking to spread an ideology or a system of government. The communists aren't to take over the world. Instead, its actions are propelled by its need to secure energy, metals and strategic materials in order to support the rising living standards of its immense population. So China's rise looks a lot like the United States, where it seeks energy sources, trade, and relations with other countries for its own prosperity and its own domestic national interests. Another factor that you have to consider is the fact that since World War I and World War II, system-wide world wars provoked by the rise of Germany, things have changed. Nuclear weapons have come onto the scene, and nuclear weapons have a very important impact, I believe, on the way leaders and others calculate going to war and engaging in diplomacy. Any escalation to nuclear confrontation, China is a nuclear power, could lead to unthinkable, devastating consequences for all parties involved, and in fact, the whole world. Now, given that, we know that from our experience with the Soviet Union, we all became much more realistic and cautious as we engaged in confrontation, knowing that this could easily escalate to nuclear war, and that was demonstrated by the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that is an important factor that we have to consider. And I might just, as a side note, as a footnote here, say I think this is an important factor to consider when we think about the way we deal with Iran and North Korea also. Secondly, neorealists assume that if states have capabilities to be aggressive, they will be aggressive. And therefore, we calculate not what they're interested in achieving, but rather what they're able to do. Now, as a realist myself, I do want to look at states' capabilities, not their intentions. Intentions are oftentimes fickle. You love people one day and you hate them the next day. It's like romance, right? But the very fact that leaders understand this dynamic makes them aware of the potential complications and confrontations that would occur if we aren't conscious of other people's views, other states' views. So in other words, we engage in strategic reassurance. We have transparency. We talk to the Chinese, they talk to us. We tell them what our intentions are and let them know what our capabilities are. We encourage them to tell us what their intentions are and to know more about their capabilities so that we can have some strategic reassurance and not just worst case, everything like, oh, they're out to get us, and that's why this military is growing so fast and so large. Sooner or later, it goes there. Now, let's switch to neoliberalism. Neoliberals believe that cooperation is motivated and enhanced by mutual benefits. The Chinese benefit from international trade. We benefit immensely from international trade. They benefit from being able to invest their money in our country. We benefit from them lending us their money. It funds our defense budget. These kinds of liberal norms, free trade, inform international institutions, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, on and on and on. And China has joined all those organizations, has been an active leader in those organizations. And as we interact with each other, they get to know us, we get to know them. We assume that they begin to internalize, become socialized into the system, and accept certain kinds of liberal international values. And they have a stake in the system. They want to perpetuate that system. So they will work hard to continue to engage in free trade and economic development, just like we will. And eventually, hopefully, this would help to improve their human rights behavior. This is this sort of neoliberal democratic peace optimism. Now, is there evidence for this? Sooner or later, it communicates with it. There we go. Neoliberals conclude that, countries' mutual interests are going to become institutionalized, and more as we become integrated, we are less and less inclined to go towards war. The likelihood of conflict is diminished. And over time, U.S.-China relations will improve as we have a growing and more integrated and complex economic relationship, and we share common security concerns in North Korea, Indian Ocean, piracy, other places of instability around the world. The belief that China will eventually tend towards democracy also underlines the fact that democracies can effectively entice other countries to adopt democratic principles, and we can push authoritarian nations to move towards democracy because they have economic interests in participating in the international system. Now, that's sort of the very optimistic view of the future of U.S.-China relations. There is some evidence, though. For example, the United States and China participate very actively in world organizations together. We are both members of the UN Security Council and consult and cooperate on that council, not always times in harmony, but we do cooperate. The G20 is an important international forum for discussion by major industrialized advanced countries. Increasingly, the G20 is what you just knock off the zero and call it the G2 because it's all about China and the United States, and the Europeans have gone by the wayside, and Japan is on the decline. So it's increasingly the United States and China. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is very important also. They have a regional forum that brings all countries in the region together to discuss common security concerns. Six-party talks refers to the North Korean nuclear issue and the effort to multilaterally deal with the complications that North Korean nuclearization causes. Now, is there any evidence that cooperation is increased? Yes, I believe there is. Despite the fact that in 1999, we bombed the Chinese embassy. I was in China when that happened. There's a lot of anger. And in April of 2001, the Chinese shot down a U.S. spy plane. These incidents rather quickly moved off of the agenda. They didn't lead to war. Both sides quickly realized that these were serious incidents, but there were larger problems that we had to deal with and work together on. So we quickly moved to not allow those incidents to complicate our relationship and push us towards some kind of international conflict. Now, let me just remind you historically, remember World War I was provoked by the simple assassination of the Archduke of Hungary by a Serb nationalist, and it led to World War I. So in days gone by, maybe these kinds of incidents, bombing someone's embassy in Yugoslavia, in Belgrade, could have led to war, or them shooting down our spy plane could have led to war. If you think what the tensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the edge of war, how close we went to the edge of war, you can see how easily miscommunications and these kinds of things can provoke war. But they didn't. And neoliberals would say, well, this was because we all had greater economic interests in cooperation. We didn't want to allow these incidents to undermine our relationship. And, let me mention in terms of human rights, Chinese are enjoying greater civil liberties now than they ever did in the past since opening up and reform. I mean, they don't enjoy the large civil liberties we enjoy, but life is much better for them. It's not the Maoist past. But let me give you some counter-arguments. As China becomes more and more powerful economically and militarily, Why won't it use international institutions to advance its own interests according to its preferences? Remember, the United States has advanced our interests through the United Nations, through the World Trade Organization, through the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, through the IMF, because we were the most powerful nation after World War II. And we essentially used those institutions to globalize or internationalize American values. Why won't the Chinese counter say, look, we have our own values. We have a Beijing consensus. And these institutions now that we very much take part in, and in fact lead, should start to reflect our values, not just your values. So China's power gives them this leverage to do that. And we can see that they would begin to try to mold international organizations to reflect their values, much as we did. And they always will talk about their core interests. You must respect our core interests. Now, when China says, in order to deal with this, you have to respect our core interests, what are China's core interests? They've said what their core interests are. Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. You can't mess with that. The domestic stability of our government. You can't do anything to undermine the political system in China, dominated by the Communist Party and a single-party dictatorship. They've also mentioned the South China Sea as a core interest and say the United States can't dominate the South China Sea. So they've asserted their core interests and say, you want us to respect your core interests, you must respect our core interests, and those core interests means that you don't try to manipulate our domestic politics and you don't mess with us in certain areas of the world that we've defined as our core interests, much like the United States has. Now, here's a Chinese quote to kind of bring this idea home. So the ironic logic is that the more China is involved in globalization, the more powerful its authoritarianism becomes. This growing economic interdependence has empowered Beijing to put political pressure on Western democracies. China's rapid economic development has given Beijing structural advantages and reversed the dependent relationship on the advanced democracies, enabling Beijing to use the leverage of economic interdependence to push its political agenda. The message is that those who want to benefit from China's economic prosperity must carefully observe Beijing's political criteria and follow them when Beijing demands, even if China's criteria conflict with domestic public opinion and democratic procedures. China has put pressure on the United States and other countries, for example, not to allow the Dalai Lama to visit. President Obama was forced to concede that and disinvited the Dalai Lama from coming to the White House because he was planning a trip to China, and he didn't want to make that trip more difficult. He subsequently allowed the Dalai Lama to come. South Africa just denied the Dalai Lama a visa to go to South Africa to celebrate the birthday of Desmond Tutu, a fellow Nobel Peace Laureate. And South Africa calculated its economic interests with China were more important than allowing the Dalai Lama to come. Those are small examples. But Taiwan, the Dalai Lama, human rights in China, dissident movements in China, the Chinese always use pressure to stop others from facilitating those or encourage those. Another example, Germany had a huge international book fair, and they had invited some dissident Chinese to come to the book fair and talk about the books they had written. These are dissident Chinese who, by the way, live outside of China. China was a major focus of this book fair because it was sort of the year of Asia. And the Chinese said, look, if you allow these people to come to your book fair, we will simply withdraw all of our participation in your book fair. And the Germans conceded and said, okay, we'll disinvite these Chinese authors who don't please Beijing. So we have to live with the reality that, in fact, the Chinese will begin to press us to compromise some of our principles that we hold dearly in order to facilitate continued economic relationships. That's the cost of dealing with China that they begin to exact. So the neoliberal view that, oh, they'll embrace our democracy, they'll embrace our standards of human rights, just ain't so, and it's not working out that way. Now, let's turn to a domestic political model. The argument is that this is the third level. You have the neo-realist, you have the neoliberal, now we have the domestic politics. The domestic politics argument is that it's a two-level model that any country's foreign policy is to a great degree determined by its domestic politics. Now, you might initially say, well, yeah, that might be true for democracies, but how could that be true for a totalitarian system like China, an authoritarian system like China's? Well, Chinese leaders are also subject to public opinion, just as our leaders are subject to public opinion. Our leaders bow to public opinion. They say anything when they campaign just to get a vote, right? And then when they're in office, they sometimes have to fulfill these promises that they unwisely made on the campaign trail, and sometimes they just forget about them, right? So we are sensitive to public opinion. Well, the Chinese leaders are also sensitive to public opinion, and as the internet and other kinds of social networking technology become more and more available in China, the Chinese government is more and more sensitive to public opinion, and we know it bends to some degree to public opinion. China also has a maturing bureaucracy. The foreign policy bureaucracy is much more mature than it used to be, and they began to have their own interests that are sometimes opposed to the military's interests, and it becomes a complex political system with pulling and hauling and trade deals being made between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of International Commerce and things. This is illustrated, President Bush's, this is Bush's Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson. He recognized this, lamenting that in America, this is manifesting itself as anti-China sentiment, as China becomes a symbol of the real and imagined downside of global competition. Just think of the recent debates in the Republican primaries. I mean, Mitt Romney, at the drop of a dime, will say, on the first day in office, I will put the sanctions on China, and we'll bring them to toe, we'll make them see the world our way. And Newt Gingrich says, we're going to be the first ones to colonize the moon. We're not going to let the Chinese do that. So it becomes a political football, and especially every primary seems to be this way, but China always becomes a whipping boy for this. And Henry Paulson lamented the fact that this sort of domestic public opinion and its fickleness is played to by politicians. And the Chinese have to do the same thing to some degree. Now, I want to turn to public opinion here. There are several excellent studies. You want to quickly jot these down. The Committee of 100 is a group of Chinese scholars that work on public opinion. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an excellent organization that does public opinion polling very often. And the Pew Research Center, of course, are like really the best. They do great public opinion polling and international. So I'm going to go through a series of graphs just to show you some different public opinion and talk a little bit about how domestic politics influences U.S.-China relations. Here, American perceptions, bad perceptions of Iran, but China's, up there a little bit, but, compared to our perceptions of Japan, it's really way up there. So Americans don't perceive China that positively. More people are negative than positive. This is much more complex. This is a 205 here's a 205 survey and a 207 survey. The 205 is only the U.S. The 207 is China survey. Look at the general public is in 207 is just a bit more favorable to China. The Chinese general public is a little bit more favorable toward the United States than we are toward them. Opinion leaders, in China, very positive in the United States. Opinion leaders in the United States, less positive. This is the one I find most interesting. Congressional staffers. Look at that negative number, 79%. It doesn't change much, 62%. I mean, if you want to see who the anti-China people are in the United States, it's the congressional staffers. Now, why do we lobby our government? Constitutionally, we are given the right to lobby our government. We should lobby our government because we have a bunch of congressional staffers. Excuse me, let's go back. We have a bunch of congressional staffers that are very anti-China. And if you want to try to improve relations in U.S.-China relations, you need to get these staffers to understand China a little bit better. This is a different way of showing it. In American general public, business leaders, less favorable. Congressional staffers, very negative. China general public, very positive. Look at this. Look at the business leaders in China, very positive. They like it. America's a great market for them, and they're very positive about the United States. U.S. business people are less positive, much less more negative about China because of the challenges of dealing with the China market and things like that, and the issues of currency manipulation and unfair trade practices. Issues of greatest concern. The issue of greatest concern for the Chinese is Taiwan, okay? That's not an issue of concern for the United States. We wonder, what's the problem? But we sell Taiwan arms. We don't recognize the country. It's pretty much consistent across here. Losing jobs, U.S. deficit, China's human rights, China's environmental degradation, pretty much, but deficit's a little bit more of a concern. China's, of course, mostly concerned about the Taiwan issue, less concerned about China's degradation. U.S. trade deficit, not much concern because it's favorable to them. China's energy consumption. So it gives you a sense that we have different concerns with each other, but we should be very mindful of the fact that for the Chinese, the Taiwan issue is a very, very sensitive issue. And we just went through a very kind of sensitive period of time over the last few weeks with the elections in Taiwan and the recent arms sales. President Obama agreed to sell Taiwan about $6 billion in arms. And the Chinese were very unhappy about that. Common interests. Trade. China's domestic stability. We think that's a common interest. They don't mention it. Energy, yes. Security in the Asia-Pacific region, we mention it. They don't mention it. Anti-terrorism, they're more concerned about that. The Chinese always criticize the United States for having a double standard on terrorism. We think our terrorists are real terrorists and their terrorists are not real terrorists. And when we put Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay for being terrorists and then release them because they really weren't terrorists, we don't send them back to China where they came from because we think the Chinese will somehow abuse their human rights. That's after we waterboarded them. Go figure, what kind of a double standard do we have? We send them to places like Palau and Bahamas, and they become golf course managers. But we won't send them back to China because we think the Chinese human rights standard is so poor. And the Chinese say, wait a minute, like you torture terrorists and you'll execute them, so why can't we do the same thing? So your terrorists should be our terrorists, and our terrorists are your terrorists. Why the double standard? This has constantly been a fight with the Chinese since the quote, war on terrorism has become such a big issue that we cooperate together on, by the way. Mutual benefits in trade, we're all pretty positive that there's mutual benefits in trade. They're really positive, but, we're all pretty positive that there's mutual benefit in trade. Congressional staffers, they're very anti-China, but they see how positive mutual trade is. So they, I'm not sure why. It would be interesting to talk to these congressional staffers and say, so really, what's the problem? And what are you most concerned about? It's probably things like human rights and security concerns, the rise of their military and stuff like that. Mutual perceptions of threat, stuff like that. Okay. Things have become complicated in China, and domestic politics has played an increasingly big role. Chinese have a heightened sense of the feelings of nationalism. Communist doctrine is no longer important to them. It's not as legitimate. And they have a lot of patriotic education efforts going on. So there's the younger Chinese. It's the younger Chinese, not the older Chinese. Younger Chinese are much more nationalistic and very angry. We refer to them as Fenqing, the angry youth. And it's the younger Chinese that press the Chinese government to take a firmer stand, to stand up against the Americans, to stand up against the Japanese, to demand apologies when offenses are made and things like this. In the United States, the consensus on foreign policy has completely fallen apart after the Cold War. It used to be before the Cold War that foreign policy stopped at the water's edge. That was a common phrase that we all had our partisan differences, but when it came to foreign policy, we stood together and we backed up the president. No longer is that the case. I mean, you only have to listen to the Republican debates of recent weeks to know how critical Republicans are of President Obama's foreign policy. And you look at the Congress and you look at public opinion, it's much more positive towards Obama, but nevertheless still a significant negative about President Obama's foreign policy. So we don't stand together on foreign policy. This creates a real problem with the Congress and the president working together to move a policy forward in unison because they just simply fight about it. And this has become very dysfunctional in recent years. So the Chinese deal with an angry, patriotic, nationalistic youth. We deal kind of with a dysfunctional cooperation between the Congress and the White House when it comes to China policy. So the conclusion that I draw is that the U.S.-China relations are in for some difficult waters, some rough waters as China grows and as the United States relatively declines. We'll continue to experience friction. Now, I don't think this friction will take us to war, but there will be, we'll go to the edge. There'll be what we call militarized international disputes where they bring their military and we bring our military to the edge, but we don't shoot at each other, like in the case of Taiwan in 1996. But the way we can work through this is by institutionalizing our relationship. We should have regularized, high-level discussions with the Chinese. We have instituted what we call the Security and Economic Dialogue under President Obama, where highest level officials from both sides get together for an extended period of time and discuss significant issues of common concern and difference. This is very important, this Security and Economic Dialogue. Here's a statement by President Obama. Now, my suspicions are this was written by John Huntsman, who was the ambassador at the time, and it kind of sounds Huntsman, but let me read it. The relationship between the United States and China will shape the 21st century, which makes it as important as any bilateral relationship in the world. That really must underpin our partnership. That is the responsibility that together we bear. No one nation can meet the challenges of the 21st century on its own, nor effectively advance its interests in isolation. It is this fundamental truth that compels us to cooperate. I have no illusion that the United States and China will agree on every issue, nor choose to see the world in the same way. But that only makes dialogue more important, so that we can know each other better and communicate our concerns with each other with candor. One last slide, and then I'll go to questions. The current Prime Minister Wen Jiabao characterized U.S.-China relations as one of harmony without uniformity. A prominent Chinese scholar gave this phrase, "He er bu re, fen er bu lie," which means, you know, we're together, but we're not hot for each other. We are divided, but we haven't completely split apart. And that characterizes, I think, what the relationship is. It's normal that two great powers have differences and have common interests, and working through those differences and those common interests are very important. So I'll just leave it there and take your questions. I think there's a microphone. They just raise your hand and they'll bring the microphone to you. This is being broadcast live on radio, so you want to state your name or something like that and get your name out there and major.
Hi, my name is Cristina Petrișu. I'm a political science major from Romania. And actually, it seems to me, I've studied a little bit about China. It seems to me that they are a big partner for the United States and they're playing a major role in the world. But at the same time, I feel like their role is not quite as big yet. You know, I mean, there's still a lot of poverty, a lot of problems in China. And I feel like oftentimes their role is overestimated. So what is your opinion about that? Do you think that is the case or not? Do you think they really are a strong partner right now?
You know, China's role is oftentimes overestimated. It kind of makes for good public press. Ooh, the Chinese, you know, second largest economy in the world, a military that's growing at, you know, 10, 15% per year. And they sort of dwell on those things. But so China's the second largest economy in the world in terms of its GDP and will be larger than the United States in maybe 20 years, given its rate of growth and our rate of growth. But that's not the important story. The important story is per capita GDP. And in terms of per capita GDP, China's ranked about 40 or 45th in the world. So it's way down there. I always tell people, remember that 1.3 billion times any number is a very big number. And any big number divided by 1.3 billion is a very small number. So when you think in per capita terms, Chinese are way below the United States. Their military, the United States military budget right now is larger than the next 15 countries combined. And China is down the list a ways. China is trying to launch an aircraft carrier, which is now just sort of in experimental trial stages. An aircraft carrier. We have 11 aircraft carriers. It's going to take decades for the Chinese to match that. I was talking with a retired admiral this past summer, and he said, you know, the Chinese press thumps their chest about, yeah, we got this aircraft carrier, we're launching it, and the Americans are going, ooh, the Chinese have an aircraft carrier. He says, as a naval admiral, I'm embarrassed. It's a 20-year-old Ukrainian aircraft carrier that was on the junk heap, and we kind of put it back together, and now we're using it to learn. We can't even land airplanes on it. So, you know, you can always overtalk the China, but when you look at the reality, China is important because it is the second largest economy. It's the largest trading nation in the world. And it's one of the largest, has one of the largest ambitions or appetites for resources in the world. So they compete directly with larger countries for resources. So it is important in that way. But I don't think the Chinese are going to take over the world anytime soon. Or ever. I just don't think that, I don't think they want to. Why would you want to have all those problems? They learn from the United States. You know, if you want to be the policeman of the world, you have a lot of problem. Why would you ever want to do that? Here's one right here in the front. Okay, we'll get you next. We promise. Go ahead, and then we'll.
You talked a lot about in the Republican primaries, they talk about Grady Baker, economics major, talking about taking tougher sanctions and especially in intellectual property.
Yeah.
They're just wondering, will the U.S. ever kind of take a stronger stance on intellectual property, especially as that becomes more of a valuable part of our economy?
Sure. Well, we try to take a tougher stand. We've had some really tough negotiations with the Chinese over the last couple of decades on intellectual property, and there has been some outcomes. The Chinese are a little bit stricter now on pirating things, but it's still very common. So we take tougher stands. I think the big change comes, though, when the Chinese themselves begin to realize that intellectual property is important to them. Remember, historically, the United States was not a respecter of intellectual property. We stole a lot of it from the British. I mean, you know, Fulton memorized how to build a steam engine and came to the United States and built it. He stole intellectual property. For a long time, we never joined copyright enterprise because we just didn't. Taiwan and others didn't. So developing nations don't respect intellectual property because they need it. Developed nations want you to respect their intellectual property because they want to sell it to you. As Chinese become more and more advanced in their scientific development and their arts and things like that, Chinese themselves become more sensitive to intellectual property issues and begin putting a lot of pressure on the government to have stricter intellectual property. So I think China will see that over time as it becomes more and more in their interest to do so. There's a cultural difference here. There's a little cultural issue. I mean, you know, China's a Confucian culture, was obsessed with promoting good ideas and things, but they were mostly obsessed with making sure that those good ideas were promoted correctly and not manipulated and changed. So they would always say, yeah, go ahead and spread my word or copy my book, but make sure you copy it correctly. Don't change it. They're saying, like, if your idea is so good, why do you want to keep it to yourself and just try to sell it to somebody? Why don't you want to give it to somebody? So but I think they're coming along.
My name is Lauren Barden, and I'm a political science major. And you gave us a couple of examples where Beijing has exerted its influence in terms of the actions of other countries, said, don't do this, don't do that. So I was wondering, how important is the relationship with China for most countries? At what point will they say, we're not going to do what you want us to do, Beijing?
Well, that's hard to say at what point they would say no. I'm sure that I'm just as a realist, as it pushes up against their own national interests, they will say no. But whether the Dalai Lama visits the White House or not is kind of it's a public relations thing, so they can press them. South Africans, you know, whether the Dalai Lama comes to South Africa, that's no big deal, but they don't want to disrupt that economic relationship. So I think that if nations started to feel that their national security interests and serious economic interests were being hindered by the Chinese and the Chinese pushing and assisting on certain things, then you would push back. The point I was trying to make, though, is that you can't, as an idealist, you want to assume that the Chinese will become like us someday, and this won't be a question anymore. They'll embrace democracy and human rights, as they should. But the Chinese, in experience, is that no, our view of human rights and our view of national interests and culture are different than yours, and we will use our leverage to press our agenda. You have what you call the Washington Consensus, and you argue the whole world agrees with Washington. We have this thing called the Beijing Consensus, and we believe most of the world agrees with us, that we shouldn't try to manipulate someone's domestic politics and push them to be democratic or have human rights. That's their sovereign right to decide. We shouldn't involve. We would be angry if these people involved themselves in our politics. I mean, people are already upset that $10 million goes from Adelson, this gambling magnate, to the Gingrich campaign, when the majority of that money, where did it come from? China. And people are unhappy about that. He has huge gambling operations in Macau. So a lot of this is Chinese money. People go, wait a minute, you can't have Chinese money manipulating American politics. That's wrong. I know some of you have to go to class. I actually teach till 1:20, so I'm happy to stay here till then and answer questions.
My name is Montranto. I'm a film student here. I guess it's kind of a dicey question, but what do you think is going to happen with this generation of Chinese in terms of how they're going to express themselves in displeasure with the government? In the past, we've seen each generation's kind of had their revolution. You have the first overthrow of the dynasties, Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen. How do you think this next generation may choose to express themselves to try and get changes going?
But if I knew the answer to that question, I'd be a very good political scientist. But political science is not that good in its predictions. I mean, we're as good as the seismologists. They can tell you big earthquakes are coming sometime in the future, but they're not quite sure exactly where and when. And we're about there with political science also. Let me just say that there is not right now in China a real active, vibrant, dissident community. They're very scattered, they're very divided. Most of them are in jail. The Chinese government has been very effective in quashing any kind of anti-government dissident movements, including people like, Liu Xiaobo, who's in jail and has a Nobel Peace Prize. But my own interactions with Chinese leads me to believe that there are a lot of liberal, open-minded Chinese that as long as life is good for them, and it's getting better, they are not going to push the political issue because it's not in their interest to do so. I have friends who now have nice apartments, who drive cars, who go abroad to Disneyland with their families and stuff. And they say, I don't agree with the government, I don't agree with communism, but I'm not going to push that issue because I would just get slapped down. And other Chinese will look at Chinese and say, why are you so stupid? You're just going to get smacked down. Why would you give up the luxuries you have and the comfort of life you have to do that? But some of them are motivated to do that. So I don't see a large critical mass of Chinese in the grassroots that are willing to stand up and lose their lives over or go to jail over political change right now, because frankly, economically, they're doing well and they're much happier than they used to be. And political change is not on everybody's agenda. So it's rather pessimistic. And by the way, over the past year, the Chinese have become more onerous and more rigorous in suppressing dissent because we're moving into a transition in politics and they just don't stand for it right now. I alluded to it, the whole internet, social media and stuff. China's very good at manipulating that, and in many ways it gives the Chinese government more powerful to control people. If people send out Twitter messages, assemble on the corner, we're going to trash the Chinese restaurant, we're going to trash the Japanese restaurant to express anger for Japan, the government will send out a Twitter and say, if you show up on that corner, we'll put you in jail. Last summer during the revolutions in North Africa, Arab states, some people would start promoting a jasmine revolution in China and says, show up in Wangfujing and have a stroll for freedom. John Huntsman went down there, participated in the stroll and got caught. The Chinese knew that was coming, so what'd they do? They brought down a bunch of water trucks. Hey, you got to clear out the streets. We have to wash the streets down, move aside, go away. And most of the people thought, oh, okay, and they just walked away. And then the guy puts a camera in John Huntsman's face and says, hey, you're ambassador to the United States. How come you're here? And he goes, first of all, he says, you don't know who I am. He goes, yes, I do. You're John Huntsman. Why are you here? And he just walked away. But he was busted two ways. It was a Sunday and he was shopping. Go ahead, Kurt. Hey, just wait for the microphone.
What you think about David Kong's argument that classical Hyer theories, especially the realist paradigm, is rooted in European experience and doesn't necessarily even apply to East Asia, where you've certainly had hegemony without the sort of balancing and conflict you've seen?
That's something I take very seriously. And there's, the debate is still, it's a great lively debate. The argument is that, China had historically had a different kind of soft power and hegemony, basically a soft power hegemony. It didn't necessarily use its military to crush all its neighbors, although we know it did. It did when its interests were threatened. But China had a different way of doing it. So this realist idea is rooted in a Western European Thucydides, Thomas Hobbes view. Actually, there's some very good studies, like, you may be familiar with Alistair Ian Johnston's argument about Chinese cultural realism, that we always, in the West, oftentimes focus on Confucianism. It's sort of like, love all, serve all, educate all. China has 7 military classics, one of them being Sun Tzu, which people are trying to focus on, but 7 military classics that talk about how to use military force to dominate others. And there was a strong legalist tradition in China also, which is a very realist tradition. So I think deeply rooted in Chinese culture, there is a realist sentiment. And Mao Zedong's realism is not Western realism, but it's very Chinese realism, rooted in Qin Shi Huangdi and the legalists and others. But they have multiple traditions like we do. Liberal and realist, they have liberal and realist too. It depends which one's the strongest. And I think ultimately it's a mix of both of those. We all, sort of dream of a liberal world, love all, serve all, but some of us keep our powder dry and think there's some bad guys out there and I'm not gonna give my guns up yet.
Hi, I'm Mongshi Seely. I had a question regarding nuclear weapons, because you said they had a stabilizing factor. I was wondering, what was your opinion on North Korea's weapons, and do they have a stabilizing effect on the region?
Well, yes, in a way they do have a perverse stabilizing factor. The United States has not invaded North Korea, right? But we did invade Iraq and Libya. So the North Koreans, in a very perverse way, are saying, we've learned a good lesson here. If you feign to be trying to get nuclear weapons like the Iraqis, the Americans will preempt and invade you. If you have them but then give them up like Libya, they'll invade you. So we've got them and we're showing them to everybody, so don't invade us. And so U.S. policy towards Iraq and Libya, I think, have had the impact upon North Korea of affirming the wisdom of having nuclear weapons and showing them to the world to stop the Americans from invading them. But it does have a destabilizing factor. Not that it's going to be a cause of war, I don't think, but rather it provokes and gives incentives for other people to proliferate and have nuclear weapons. The Japanese will respond, the Taiwanese will respond, and then we have this nuclear weapon proliferation problem, which I don't think is a good idea. But I don't think that just because states have nuclear weapons, they're going to use nuclear weapons. Usually they get nuclear weapons because it's good politics to have them, but they're not very good for military use. So you get them to intimidate other people and deter them from attacking you, but you never entertain the idea that you'd actually go to war and use these nuclear weapons, because that would be disastrous.
I was just wondering, stand up. You said that the general opinion in the U.S. about China is really negative, and I know that a lot of people have said that's because they're jealous of Chinese stealing their jobs, or about human rights in China not being very good. Which one do you think is the main cause?
Well, remember, I think the poll said about 52% of the Americans were favorable, but 48. So it's about 50-50, and it's both of those things. I mean, a large number of Americans don't like China because it abuses human rights, and it doesn't adopt the same standard of civil liberties that we have and that we think they should have. So that's a factor. There's a group of working class people, kind of Tea Party types, populist types who always press the issue about China stealing our jobs, but remember that survey also showed that everybody was very positive about trade. The question of does China steal our jobs is complicated. On the whole, I don't think they do. I think the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Koreans just stole them a long time ago. So you get a job. What, are you going to start making TV sets or transistor radios or iPads or something? If you don't have a job, you'd probably be happy to have that, but most Americans don't do that. In other words, the jobs that China is taking are largely being lost by Koreans and Taiwanese and Japanese, and they're very worried about that. And now the Chinese, by the way, are very worried about the Vietnamese stealing their jobs, because Vietnam's standard wages are lower. And so a lot of Chinese jobs are going to Vietnam. But it's complex. The United States, gave up manufacturing a long time ago, and I'm a fan of manufacturing. I think we need to have manufacturing in the United States. But over the long term, it's interesting that a study I was reading a few weeks ago, some business people were saying, if you look down the road 10 or 15 years and you're thinking about investment, that given the rise in oil prices, the cost of insurance and transportation for goods coming from China to the United States, simply the aggravation and frustration with managing quality control in businesses in China, even though it might cost you a little more in wages in the United States to produce a product, management is on site and quality control is easy to control. You don't have the transportation costs. So in the long run, your margin of profit may be cut a little bit, but you might be better off producing in the United States, because then you don't have to deal with all the frustration of going to China and making sure that quality is good. And China's having its own labor movement is starting to rise, so you're going to see more and more labor unrest in China, disruption of supplies and marketing in China. So some people are predicting that actually in a decade or so we'll see this gradually turn around, and where American companies will begin to be much more competitive in manufacturing for a variety of now new kinds of reasons, not just the old steel mill kinds of reasons, but high tech and efficient management and free movement of capital and labor and stuff like that. China has serious problems with free movement of labor and things like that too. So it's a very complicated picture. It's not easy just to say they take our jobs, but there is a perception of that. And politicians certainly play that game. One last question that somebody really wants to ask or two. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andrew Brown. I'm studying public relations. My question is, you mentioned that there are some Chinese who are very successful, they're enjoying luxury, and they say that they don't agree with the Chinese government, but they won't do anything to change the political system. Then you also said that there's this movement among the young Chinese that they want China to be more powerful, more strict with the U.S. What is the government in China currently? Is it communist? Is it not communist?
Let me, is that the other question? I'm sorry, I jumped in.
Yeah, and then just also, how does that affect the human rights issues? Are there really still human rights concerns in China, and what are they?
Let me quote the Chinese ambassador to the UK a year or so ago. A press person asked her, "Is China a communist country?" She said, "China is not a communist country, but it's run by a communist government." China is a very capitalistic country, a very free-flowing capitalistic country without many of the restrictions on capitalism that we have in the United States in terms of safety for working class people and stuff like that. But it's a single-party dictatorship. It's a communist party. Now, to what degree they're dedicated to Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong, I think it's rather minimally. I mean, I have friends who are members of the Communist Party, and they're just, it's like a chamber of commerce to them. It's good connections. It's a country club or something. And there are serious human rights problems in China. Constraints on freedom of religion, constraints on the press, constraints on advocacy of multi-party democracy. All those things are if you advocate multi-party democracy, you'll go to jail quickly. So there are what the Chinese call the cardinal principles. The cardinal principles are you can't question the single-party leadership of the Communist Party. You can't question the building of socialism with Chinese characteristics. You cannot demean or criticize Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought as the guiding ideology. Those are cardinal principles. So you stay away from those, and you can criticize potholes and inefficiency and corruption, and people do that. So they have a wider spectrum of human rights now than they did during the Mao period, but it's still very constrained by our standards, very constrained by our standards. The youth are angry, but the youth are not angry in the same way they were in the 1980s. The youth in the 1980s were angry about the government and its domination and corruption. They were sort of the liberal 1980s students. The students today are angry when the government doesn't stand up for China and when they feel that China is picked on or criticized by the West, that it doesn't stand up to the United States. Like when the EP-3 spy plane was shot down, the Chinese students were calling for war. And the government was going, oh, that's not a big issue. And so the Chinese government is on this very difficult situation where if they don't vigorously stand up and criticize the United States or take some action against the United States, the young youth will say, oh, this is a wimpy government, just as the government in 1919 was a wimpy government, and there was a huge student demonstration in 1919 to criticize the government for not standing up against Western power or Japan. So that's difficult. So they're in this situation where if we respond to this groundswell of angry youth who are very nationalistic, our relationship with the United States and the Europeans and the Japanese becomes more difficult. So we need to, how do we rein in this anger of this youth, yet also push our interests with these governments without pushing too far to cause a split in relationship? So it's very, very difficult. As one of my Chinese friends said, Chinese officials never take a vacation. When you are the only party in power and you have 100% control, you also have 100% responsibility. Anything goes well, you may get credit, but anything that goes wrong, you absolutely get blamed for it. So it's a very, very difficult job for them. Did that answer all of your questions? Okay.